Before I begin the sermon, let me ask you a question. Did you see near the end of Maribel's dance that she moved into that tree pose of yoga? Did you see that? Now, in yoga, the tree poise represents a balance and a centeredness. Your one leg becomes that tree stump into the ground, grounded, rooted, connected with all things. The tree pose. A couple weeks ago, I was at a conference for our ministers from all around the country, and we gathered and we were sharing about the difficult times in church and the chaos and tumult of our times, and there was a lot of anxiety. And right after the opening session, we had a yoga class, and she began by having all the ministers go into that tree pose, but all of a sudden we all just fell over. Nobody could hold their balance because these are unbalanced times. I'll return to that ministers' conference at the end of the sermon. About 20,000 years ago, the sea level lowered and a land bridge emerged between northern Siberia and western Alaska. And those early humans took a long walk across and into North America. After about another 1,000 years, some of those early humans moved into this territory we call Nebraska. People are still slow to move to Nebraska, but it's always better than they thought it was. Around 10,000 years ago, those early humans coalesced into the tribes that we know, the Missouri, the Omaha Oto tribes, the Ponca tribe. And the Pawnee developed agricultural settlements along the Platte River. And in the middle of the state were the wandering tribes, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, the Lakota Sioux. It would be many thousands of years before anyone of European descent moved into this land. And we know that when they did, history is a combination of pain and injustice and complexity with migrating peoples. It was in 1801 that Thomas Jefferson became the third president of the United States, and he had a desire to open up the western lands for farmers. In 1803, Napoleon needed to sell some land because of a revolt in Haiti, and so we had the Louisiana Purchase. For $15 million, we bought, well, it wasn't really our land to buy, but again, the complexity of histories, this whole swath. And so it was in 1803 that Thomas Jefferson contacted his good friend and protege, Captain Clark, asked him to explore those lands. Captain Clark went into Kentucky, met up with his good friend Lewis, and now Lewis and Clark became some of the earliest people of European descent to come into this territory we call Nebraska. Now, they found a land that was mostly devoid of trees. Now, let me leave the complexity of human history when some place is already someone else's home, and let me leave all that complexity and focus on trees. Oh, there were very few trees in Nebraska. Of course, along the rivers there were trees, but a tree couldn't handle the open prairie and the fires that would sweep through. And these early settlers then came in, these peoples of European descent came into the land. And can you imagine how hard it was to live without trees? Think about that. What do you build your home with? What do you create your tools out without wood? How do you live without trees? They tried to forge a way, creating these homes out of sod instead of wood. But it was so difficult. How do you protect yourself from the sun and the wind and the elements? So they began to plant trees. In 1862, the Homestead Act created a special impulse. If you put down timber, you had a claim on the land. And so it was in 1863 is the earliest recorded planting of a tree, 1853, excuse me, that first tree. But then it was in 1872 was the first Arbor Day. And the Nebraska papers report that 1 million trees were planted on that day. Trees began to be planted. Well, it was in 1866 that our church began, still in a land mostly devoid of trees. The plantings were just beginning. And even when we moved this church out here in the 1920s, there were just saplings. Oh, these great pin oaks around the building were just little saplings. And so this church from 1866 essentially grew up with the trees in Lincoln. And we planted more and more trees until Lincoln became a community forest. There are now some 500,000 acres of community forest in Nebraska, and this town is now filled with elm and ash and Scotch pine and juniper and hardwood species of all kinds. Trees. As I mentioned, we're celebrating trees this day along with 30 Lincoln churches. Our climate action team has helped develop this celebration of trees because we know as a people of faith we're called to care for God's creation and be good stewards, and that climate change will be especially hard on our trees, and so we're lifting up that element. Trees. And so they asked me to preach about trees. If you ask a preacher to preach about trees, why go to the Bible? What role do trees play in the Bible? Well, of course, trees for all time have been these companions for human beings, and so trees are the most commonly mentioned living organism in our scriptures. Of course, sycamores and olive trees and cedars of Lebanon and trees are everywhere. And you may not have this in your mind, but the entire gospel story is essentially outdoors. The entire story of Jesus' life and ministry is taking place outdoors. They're practically never inside. They're outside among the trees. And oh, how the olive trees played a role in his life. They're out there on the earth and among the trees. Oh, but if you ask me about trees and Scripture, there's one. Oh, there's a tree in the Bible. And as I work my way through this, you will see that this one tree becomes most central. I'm speaking of the tree of life. It appears in Genesis 2. Well, there's two trees in the Garden of Eden that are mentioned. The tree of good and evil, you know that story, that's for another day. But the tree of life is mentioned in Genesis 2, the tree of life. And then our Bible is bookended by this tree of life. It's mentioned in Proverbs and Psalms, but then it's in Revelation 22 at the culmination of the whole biblical story. The tree of life emerges again. The tree of life. This deep symbol of God's creation, of an interconnectedness of all things, a flourishing of life. Oh, this symbol has become so important. Do you know Joseph Campbell? Joseph Campbell was this great mythologist at Sarah Lawrence. And he attuned us to the fact that there are symbols, there are myths and symbols that are ubiquitous in humanity, that in the psyche of humanity everywhere, there are certain key symbols and myths. And the tree of life is one of these. You will see it in every culture, in many different guises. The tree of life, representing again this flourishing, this connection, this groundedness. You see it everywhere. The Muslims, they call it the tree of immortality. They have the Garden of Eden in the Quran. There is the tree of life. The Buddhists with the Bodhi tree, under which the Buddha achieved enlightenment. Oh, you see the tree of life everywhere. Do you remember Avatar? Oh, I love that movie. Do you know another one's coming out this year? Can't wait. But in that movie is a perfect representation of the tree of life because it's so mythic. Do you remember on the planet Pandora, the people there, the Na'vi? Oh, James Cameron. Na'vi, that's the Hebrew word for prophet. He's already drawing the deep connections, trying to take your mind right into Genesis. On Pandora, the Na'vi have a most holy site. What is the most holy site? It's at the tree of souls. And this is the perfect image of the tree that appears in Genesis. The Na'vi, do you remember Jake Scully was wounded and they brought him to the tree of souls? This tree of souls is able to send out its roots and become one with the central nervous system of people and unite everyone. Well, the tree of life in Genesis spreads its roots into the DNA of Scripture itself and works its way all through the story. Let me tell you how it does this, and it's very mystical. The tree of life in Genesis puts out its roots like the tree of souls and connects to the central nervous system of our Bible. It connects right to the Christ. Let me explain. It's amazing how symbols can evolve and transfigure. So you need to follow me here. Follow me first to what we consider the most central symbol of our faith. You know what I speak of, the cross. The most central symbol of Christianity. Remember that it is amazing that this became the symbol of love and faith and hope. It's amazing because remember in the gospel story what a cross is. It's upon the cross that Romans crucified people. The Romans crucified thousands of young Palestinian males. And when they crucified someone, they would do it along roadsides. So the people were forced to walk by these crosses with people dying on them, and they were terrorized into submission. It is a horrible thing. How did this become our symbol of love? It was a technique of execution. How'd this become our symbol of love? It's almost like hanging an electric chair up on the wall as our central. How did this happen? Oh, through the power of Christ. For he chose to live in such love and to sacrifice himself for us that when the Christ is upon the cross, it is completely transformed into our image of love. But watch how the tree of life sends out its roots. For it's then in the book of Acts that we are told twice that Jesus was hung on a tree. On a tree? Is that what well, of course, you know a cross would have been a large branch and another one crosswise, stripped of any leaves and such and twigs. Of course, it was a tree. Jesus was hung on a tree, and the symbols begin to merge. Pope Benedict said the tree of life is the Christ. St. Bonaventure said the tree of Christ, the tree of life, its fruit is the Christ. These symbols merge together. That so when you see a cross, it is the tree of life within that power of Christ. Oh, especially when you see a cross with a circle around it. Later today, Google images of a tree of life. It looks almost exactly like that Celtic cross or the cross with a circle. Oh, symbols. I don't know how much you vibe on symbols. You see, Joseph Campbell thought it was a symbol, the symbol that could exhilarate the human soul in ways beyond words. And do you realize that our religion is this dense entwinement of symbols upon symbols upon symbols? And Campbell thought this is what activates the human being and gives them a sense of purpose, something beyond words, something they just know without even knowing they know it. Do you wear a cross? This tree of life, this beauty of Christ, do you wear a cross? You might consider such, just to be reminded through symbolic power of this life to which we're called. I think I just made some money for local jewelry stores. The tree of life. Oh, back to the ministers' conference. I almost forgot. Really. We were so anxious being ministers in these times. But after the next day of listening to one another and seeing the hope that is the church, the hope that is our Christ, the next day when she led us through the tree pose, every minister stood perfectly balanced the next day. A tree that is calm and still even when chaos is around. Be a tree. Don't be a reed blowing in the wind. Be a tree.